I think what makes this work so special is that it's painted at a very pivotal moment in Gauguin's career, where he's moving from one style really into the other and moving towards what we consider his high style, which is when he was painting in Tahiti. This work has very much still an eye on the more traditional forms that Gauguin was very much influenced by. It almost has the feel of an Old Master 17th century Dutch still life or memento mori. But it also has the genesis of his much more striking, colourful, bold style that you associate with his later work, which we see in the very bright reds, blues, and oranges of some of the brushwork. When you stand away from the work, it comes across as this very beautiful, decorative, gentle, almost poetic still life. And then the closer you get to the work, you notice this almost fauve. It's almost fauve in the unseparated, bright colour that's not been mixed. He's taken it directly from the palette onto the canvas without any mixing. And together that creates the type of palette that he's used is quite subdued. So in general, it creates this very harmonic whole, or harmonious whole. But when you look closely, you see this divided colour, which is completely what we would associate with his work later on. So it's very special to see that the beginnings of really his great work in this what I find a much more gentle, more obviously beautiful piece than his kind of wilder work of his later years. So as I mentioned with this work, looking back towards more traditional forms, the artist that really comes to mind when we look at this piece is Fontaine-Latour, who we may not associate normally with Gauguin, but actually Gauguin held Fontaine-Latour in very high regard, not least because he was a fabulous painter, but he was also, like Gauguin, someone who understood the way the art market at that time worked. He had a couple of very important patrons in Britain who were great fans of Fontaine-Latour and really did a lot to raise Fontaine-Latour's profile in Britain. That's why we have such amazing works by that artist in public collections in Britain. It's all the product of this relationship that Fontaine had. And I think Gauguin was partly looking at the example of Fontaine when he painted this work and saying, okay, I want to have a wider clientele. I want my paintings to be seen and to be in collections. How can I achieve this and still achieve my artistic goals? So work like Bouquet de Roses is quite key in looking at how Gauguin achieved that or tried to achieve it by painting something that's essentially almost like a Fontaine-Latour, this very calm, beautiful still life. But at the same time, it has those seeds of Gauguinness that we would look for in one of his works, whilst being kind of more palatable, let's say, than some of his more extreme works. But also that stillness that Fontaine-Latour is very famous for, the poetry of his works. I think we see that in this piece as well, a real stillness, but not with such a kind of porcelain surface as Fontaine. This is much more broken up and dynamic. I think although the sense of the painting is very still, when you look at the surface and the way that it's been worked up, it's actually, there's a lot of dynamism and movement in the paintwork itself. Another artist that Gauguin was looking at around this time was Cézanne. There had been a major exhibition of Cézanne's work around this time, so Gauguin was certainly familiar with a broad range of his works. And most importantly, Gauguin actually owned in his personal collection a still life by Paul Cézanne, and he prized it amongst his most precious belongings. He was even quoted as saying that he would keep that work until he had to sell the shirt from his back. So it's clear that Gauguin held Cézanne in the highest regard. In Cézanne's still life paintings, Gauguin recognized how to combine the modern style, the extreme style that Gauguin was looking to produce in his work, whilst at the same time treating basically a very traditional subject matter. So if we think of Cézanne's most famous still lives of oranges or apples, you have this fiery colour, very bright colour, surrounded by and delineated by quite thick, heavy outer lines and brushstrokes of quite dark tones. And that's something that, if you look at Gauguin's works, that's really a hallmark of his, is very bright colour, but very clearly delineated from the other colour planes, using quite dark pigment. And although this work has a more scattered surface than you would normally associate with Cézanne, you still see that propensity towards very bright colour, which was something that Cézanne was using quite often in his work. And I think that kind of relationship between, you really see the two influences, Fontaine, Latour on one hand, in this very traditional and, as I said, almost old masterly approach to still life, and Cézanne, who's really using still life to push a very modern agenda in painting. And Gauguin's kind of looking at the two and trying to work out how he can do that whilst creating something that essentially would help promote his own work and would be commercially effective for him. Renoir painted Les Oliviers de Cagnes at his villa called Les Colettes, just outside of Cagnes, which is on the French Côte d'Azur. In this work, we see a very typical scene of the olive grove outside of his cottage. It appears to be, say, an olive picker walking through the grove, and these kind of beautiful shadows and the lightness of the olive trees. Renoir painted this in 1909, so he'd just been at Les Colettes for 2 years by this point, but had completely fallen in love. And I think you see the fondness for the place in this painting. You can really feel the affection that he has for the place itself. The olive trees are one of the classic symbols of Renoir's work from this period. Obviously, the south of France, they grow a lot of olives, a lot of vines, so it's very typical. But he found in the olive trees this puzzle of how to display colour and light. Because if you imagine the silvery leaves of the olive trees fluttering, Renoir watched this and he said that it was one of the greatest problems that he'd ever encountered as a painter, was each time he would set up his easel to sit in the garden and look at the olive trees, with every moment that the wind moved the olive leaves, they changed colour. So Renoir was fascinated by how to capture this. And I think in this work you see with this incredible fluttery paint strokes, that was how he was attempting to capture this. And I think he does an excellent job of capturing that movement and the subtlety and all the different colours that were refracting in the light. So it's a very beautiful scene, a very lush. You feel the heat of the south of France in all of those colours, the pinks, blues, yellows that he uses. At the beginning of Renoir's career, he was very much one of the leaders of Impressionism, working with the other Impressionists, creating this new modern type of painting. He very much followed the Impressionist standard of creating works that were informal and appeared spontaneous. So for instance, his landscapes or his city scenes of Paris, they capture unformulated moments in the street life of Parisians. They look like snapshots or like photographs, completely unstaged, very casual looking, and that was the whole thing that the Impressionists were trying to do, this modern life and taking painting away from the atelier and the studio and bringing out into real life and into everyday happenings. Later on, as Renoir's career grew and his art became more mature, he starts to go back, as as artists often do, he returns to the art that he loved as a student. So when Renoir was growing up and studying in Paris, he, like every art student at that time in Paris, and still today, went to the Louvre to copy the great artists. And of course, the collection at the Louvre includes the best collection of 18th century and early 19th century French painting. So artists like Eugène Delacroix, Fragonard and Watteau were the paintings that Renoir was copying at this time and studying and taking lessons from. And you do see, even in Renoir's early work, the blush of the cheeks of the women that he painted is very much something that you would see in Fragonard. So he does owe a debt to them even in the early stages of his career, when he's slightly more avant-garde, say, than at this point. But at this point in his career, when he moves to the south of France and he's really enjoying life, you see a return to these early influences. Although it does look informal and it has this kind of spontaneity of the light scattering, the actual composition itself is quite structured. If you look at the trees, there's definitely a framing mechanism at play here. The figure is off-center, as all great compositional structures are done. I think this is something where he's really structured it deliberately to appear pleasing, and that's something that very much with Watteau you see in his paintings, where although they show figures relaxing, like a déjeuner sur l'herbe kind of subject, which was something that obviously before Manet, that was something that Watteau was doing. These people enjoying the countryside was his kind of subject. But it was very structured and lacked any kind of modernity. It was deliberately classical. Because artists like Watteau and Fragonard were very much looking to that tradition. So here we see Renoir enjoying some nostalgia, let's say, and also looking back to classicism. I think for him, he felt that moving to Canyon and living in Les Colettes was very much an idyll, this classical, bucolic place. And you see it with other artists who moved down to that area of France. Picasso's the most obvious example, also Chagall, Léger. The subjects that they tend to treat on arriving in this place, in this area, were those of classical Rome, classical Greece, of this freedom and this away from the city of Paris and away from modernity. Not only did they leave the 20th century, but they leave the modern age and they go back to the ancient world where, you know, they assume that life is simple and the simple pleasures, which is certainly what Renoir was enjoying when he lived here. I think we see it in this work. We get a real sense of the contentment that he is enjoying in his life, but also in his work. You can see that this is the master at play. He's really learned his craft completely, and now he's really going for it in terms of how to display light and shade and the movement of the air. This is kind of a masterclass from Renoir.